All right, perfect. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kat Lawson. I'm the Director of Voter Protection for the North Carolina Democratic Party. So this training session should take between hopefully not too much longer than about 45 minutes. I will make sure that I pause throughout the presentation to ask you all for questions. Do feel free also to throw any questions into the chat if you have them. I will answer them as I go, and if I don't get to any, I will answer them at the end. So please make sure to ask any questions, get any clarification that you all need to make sure that you're comfortable with the material that we cover tonight. So just so you know kind of what to expect. So the kind of sequence of topics we're going to go through are kind of what are the goals of outdoor poll observing and the expectations for folks who do specifically sign up to do this kind of volunteer role. We're going to talk about, as an outdoor poll observer, what are you looking for? Kind of what are the big things that you can pay attention to and watch out for to make sure that your polling location is safe and welcoming to all voters. We'll talk about how to talk to voters during nonpartisan municipal elections. We don't typically get indoor observers, so engaging with voters as they leave the polling site is a great source of information if you all choose to do that. And then we'll talk about how you can report on any problems or issues you see, and we'll talk about all the different resources that will be made available to you all, both kind of as hard copy materials that you can save, to your iPad, to your iPhone, or print out to take with you, and then what remote support are going to be available. So make sure to drop any questions that you have into the chat. I'll also give you a chance to come off of mute and ask questions at periodic points. So I'll make sure that I get to all of your questions. And one of the things that always tends to come up in observer trainings, whatever the context is that there is a lot of practical variation between counties, right? In terms of kind of what your own county's norms have developed separate from what the technical rules and laws are. So if you do hear anything that I say and you're just like, I don't think that's how they do it in my county, feel free to share that experience or story, or just know that yep, maybe your county does it a little bit differently and you get to use some of your judgment and the information that we talk about tonight to know whether or not that's something to follow up with later in your county as a suggestion that maybe they should bring it back in line with these standards. So my goal is that for this session and by the end of this evening, you will understand what the role of an outdoor poll observer is. You'll know how to identify and solve problems at a voting site, and you'll also understand basically how to talk to voters, especially about some key issues that we'll discuss, and then report on any of those issues that do come up. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, what is the point of outdoor poll observing? So, normally we're used to our indoor poll observers doing a whole lot of work during elections, but we still do really want to make sure that we have outdoor poll observers during our municipal years. So first of all, the outside environment of a polling site really does set the tone for a voter's experience when they show up. So we want to make sure that it is a welcoming place, that it's a safe place, that there are no obvious barriers to voting or intimidating environments. And so we want to make sure that we're looking out for that for voters who vote this year. But we also want to make sure we're being strategic about the information and the data that we gather this year so that we can make better strategic choices for 2026. We all know that voter intimidation and voter suppression and just rampant disinformation and misinformation are increasing right now. And we can't trust the Republican Party to be a good faith partner in any of these activities anymore. So that means that we need to start be thinking on the offensive about how we are going to best protect the vote in 2026. Making sure that we are monitoring the elections this fall, which is the first fall that Republicans are now in control of the county boards and the state board for about a decade, is going to help make sure that we have that good sort of data and information so that we can be making good plans for next year. As an outdoor observer, you will obviously be posted outside. So you will not be actually walking into the voting building unless you are specifically trying to get in touch with a chief judge or a precinct judge, and we'll talk about that later. You will instead be staying outside what's called the buffer zone of the voting site. So you will be responsible for basically monitoring everything that's happening in the parking lot, in kind of the campaign and election area, and talking to voters as they leave the building. So what you'll be doing is you will be observing poll workers at curbside voting. You'll be making sure that the outside advocates, campaigns, third parties, random people who are there at the voting site are playing by all the rules. You will be the person who gets to ask to speak with the chief judge at the precinct if you need to, if you see that there's a problem and you want them to try and address it. You will also be there to follow up with voters who have had a problem inside, right, once they come out. And then you will also be the person who gets to escalate any problems to the statewide boiler room. So call in and say, hey, there's a problem happening in this site. Can you all, lawyers in the boiler room, which we'll talk about, can you follow up on this? And in order to kind of navigate all these things, here are the different resources that y'all will have. So first of all, there is going to be a statewide boiler room. So this will be kind of a small group of vetted attorneys who repeatedly volunteer in the boiler room, who know election law in North Carolina, know kind of who to call and complain to, know when we might need to go to outside lawyers, and answer questions that you all have. There is also an Outdoor Observer quick guide. So this is a document that will be emailed to you all after this session, with kind of a checklist of legal requirements, a short overview of the issues we're going to talk about tonight, and references to the actual statutes and official laws that govern all of these things. So that when you are doing any advocacy or when you're checking on anything, you're not going to be asking people to kind of take you at your word. You're going to be able to point to the actual sources on all of these issues. And then you'll also be shared with you will be a voter survey with just a quick list of questions that you can use to initiate conversation with a voter who's leaving the voting site that is specifically tailored to some of the main things that we are worried about this cycle. So again, the slides will be sent to you all later, and this information is on there, but if you want to go ahead and save these numbers, you can. So if you did any observing last year, this is the exact same boiler room number we used last year. It's the one we will continue to use now. And then I do want to make sure that it's clear that this is a volunteers only phone number. So the boiler room number is not for just kind of anybody in the community. This is meant for y'all who are specifically volunteering as observers or who are greeters at polling sites who are also kind of pulling double duty. This is for you all. Anything that we want voters to be reaching out and asking questions about, they can call the voter assistance hotline. And so that's the number that we share on campaign materials and in person when we're talking to voters. All right. So what you all get to do as outdoor observers. So you are allowed to walk around the perimeter of the voting site. You are allowed to introduce yourself to voters who are standing in line, right? Letting them know, hey, I am here to help. And you're able to make sure that they know that they're allowed to ask questions about what their rights are, or anything else that they have concerns about. You're also allowed to kind of be on the lookout at the exit area to see if there are voters who are leaving the polling place, right, who maybe don't look particularly happy. And you're allowed to ask them, right, how was your experience voting today? So you're allowed to have those conversations with them, both coming into the voting site and leaving the voting site. And you're entitled to report on any problems that you observe or that you experience. What you're not allowed to do, right, is first of all, be the initiator of hostility or arguments with the election workers who are there, with other greeters, or with other observers. It is very possible and probably even likely that the Republican Party will also have their own people at these sites. They will at least most likely have their own greeters at polling sites. And so we want to make sure that we are kind of towing the line and following the rules and not being the ones who start or escalate fights and arguments with other folks. If you are serving only as an outdoor observer, right, and not also there in some capacity as a greeter, you also want to make sure that you are minimizing your kind of partisan presentation. So part of this is because if you do see a problem and you need to go inside to ask to speak to a chief judge, you're not allowed to wear campaign materials when you walk into the voting site. And so if you are wearing, right, like your County Democratic Party t-shirt or a candidate t-shirt, just make sure that you bring something that you can put over it in case you do need to go inside. Obviously, if you're greeters, I'm sure you will be decked out in all of your Democratic gear. So just be mindful of that. We want to make sure that when we're interacting with voters, they know that when we are here as voter protection kind of advocates and resources, that we are doing that with an eye towards, like, we are giving truthful information. It's not, tainted by partisan affiliation in any way. If you were there, right, as an outdoor observer in particular, that also means, right, you're not engaging in electioneering or campaigning. You're making sure that you're not entering that 50-foot buffer zone, that enclosure into the voting space. We also want to make sure that even if there are problematic things that we are observing at the site, we don't want to be filming or recording or taking photos of voters themselves. So if you do see something that you do feel like it needs to be documented in some way, just try to do it in a way that's not going to make voters feel like they are being filmed. Especially right with everything kind of the way they are, that in and of itself could make a voter feel really intimidated and potentially unsafe at the voting site. And we just don't want to contribute to that. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that we are not disrupting the voting process in any way. And so within that kind of broad category of here's why you're there and what you're trying to accomplish, let's talk more specifically about what you can look out for. So at every single voting site, you can think of them as having these different zones. So the voting site, right, that is the building where voting happens, all of its surrounding area, right, its parking lot. And so this is the kind of the whole site where everybody sets up their chairs and their tables and talks to voters and tries to persuade them, right, in those last couple of steps that they should vote for your candidate of choice. Before you get to the building typically, or right at the entrance to the building, there is a buffer zone. So according to the law, there has to be a buffer zone of between 25 feet and 50 feet where you're not quite in the voting enclosure yet, but you're close enough that nobody's allowed to do any more campaigning. So you can think of this as like, this is the sacred space for voters to just kind of think about what they're about to do. And so we are no longer allowed to talk to them. And then once you get past that buffer zone, you get into the actual place, whether that's the building itself or a room within the building, where the voting machines are set up and where the voters actually vote. And so there are slightly different. So we are going to be spending our time right outside of that buffer zone. So when you first get there, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to check to see how has the polling site been set up. You want to make sure first that there are clearly marked curbside voting spaces, right, that have poll workers that are paying attention to them. You're going to check to make sure there are safe and accessible pathways, and you're going to look to make sure that that the campaign signage and all of the advocacy signs that are up and around are appropriate and not veering into voter intimidation. So with a couple more details, curbside voting in particular is something we always want to make sure is being provided. Every single voting site, both during early voting and on election day, needs to have a designated space for curbside voting. And that space should be clearly marked, and it should have boundaries on all four sides of the car. Now, this might look different. This definitely will look different from location to location, depending on the kind of natural setup of that site. But no matter what the kind of accessibility to dedicated parking spots, or whether those are just spaces that have been kind of marked off in chalk, there needs to be signage and there needs to be clear spaces where folks who need to do curbside voting know that they are able to park. And there needs to be poll workers who are either regularly checking to make sure that nobody's sitting out there in their car for a long time, or who are permanently posted outside looking for those cars. And you also want to make sure that those parking spaces are clearly marked off, because one of the things that's unique about curbside voting is they essentially carry their buffer zone with them. So candidates and campaigns and parties, all of these folks are not allowed to go up and like knock on the window of the car and ask to talk to the voter. We're not allowed to harass a voter who is essentially a captive audience because they're sitting in their car waiting to vote. So we want to make sure that that is being protected and maintained, and that there are all of those very clear signs. The other thing we're looking for, right, is the general safety and accessibility of the polling site. So when you think about this, you want to think about what is going to be the path of the voter once they get here, right? So what is it like to go from, right, the parking lot or the drop-off zone, if it's public transport, through the pathway, through the route to the door, and what is the signage all along the way? So we're going to look for accessible parking separate from curbside voting, right? Making sure that there are places where folks who need accessible parking are able to easily get it. We're also going to make sure that there is a clear, accessible path from the parking area to the entrance of the building. So this means we're checking to see, is the only way to get to the building that's able to be clearly seen have a whole bunch of steps? Right? Is there an alternate route that has really clear signs so that somebody who can't navigate steps knows where to go instead? If instead the voting site has decided that they are going to put in ramps, right, to either cover up some like short steps or the curb from the parking lot into the building, is that ramp stable, right? Is it wide enough to actually accommodate somebody who is in a wheelchair? So we're making sure that all of that route is clear, that there are ways for somebody who has some sort of disability or physical impairment is able to get to the voting site without too much trouble. And we're making sure that there are really good signs to show them where to go and how to get into the actual building itself. What we're really trying to avoid is one, a voter injuring themselves, right? When they are trying to vote because they weren't able to find a safer path to the building. And we're also trying to avoid a voter getting there thinking that there's not an easy way for them to get into the building and then turning around and leaving because they weren't able to identify an accessible path. So our goal is to make sure that the overall setup is safe and accessible. And then finally, around the site, we're going to be paying close attention to the signage. So the shoulds of campaign signs, right, are, there are separate rules and regulations about what their size can be. Really, we're making sure that those signs are outside of the buffer zone, right? So once you see a buffer zone that's marked off with a sign or with chalk or whatever it is, there should be no more signs for a candidate, for an issue, for a party that go beyond that buffer zone. Right. And we're also making sure that those campaign signs are advocating right for and against party candidates or issues. Those are the things that are allowed. Campaign signs, however, are not allowed to block the path from the parking area to the voting enclosure. So especially if you're at a voting site where the path from the parking lot to the building is maybe a dirt path or a gravel path, signs are not allowed to actually go into the middle of the path, right? You can't make voters just walk all around it. They need to be to the sides of the path. We also get to look out to make sure that campaign signs are not spreading misinformation or intimidating voters. I want to emphasize here that when you hear, right, whether or not a sign is intimidating voters, that feels really subjective. It's actually a really strict standard. And so I want to show you all these two signs that were at a lot of different locations this last fall. One of these signs was held to be totally fine, and the other one was not. So both signs, right? One of them is in English. The yellow one you can see is in Spanish. The flip side of the yellow one was also, the flip side of the white sign was also in Spanish. But both of these signs essentially said that if you're not a citizen of the United States of America, you're not allowed to vote in the election. Both of these signs said that it is illegal, right, to vote in an election if you are not a US citizen. The one part of these signs that was different from each other is that the white sign said you could be deported if you vote and are a non-citizen, and the yellow sign said you will be deported if you vote as a non-citizen. Both of these signs were brought to the attention of the state board elections last year. We're like, hey, one, putting out all these signs, in Spanish, telling people to stop, it's just meant to harass, intimidate, and scare potential Spanish-speaking voters, right? We don't have a problem with non-citizens voting in elections. This is not a big thing that we need to be concerned about. And so the argument was that these are intimidating, right? These are harassing and they potentially spread misinformation because you could have become a naturalized citizen, and these are not really that clear about that distinction. The board said that the white sign could stay, but that the yellow sign had to go. And the reason was that the white sign, because it said you could be deported based on this crime of voting as a non-citizen, that is technically true. It was possible, right, that you would be deported if you did indeed vote as a non-citizen. Because the yellow sign said you will be, and it said it as an absolute fact, instead of allowing for some possibility, right, that it wouldn't actually happen, that one was held to be misinformation and intimidation. And so that is how carefully these laws and these rules are interpreted. And as a reminder, that interpretation, right, that allowed those white signs to stay, that was made by a Democratic board of elections and democratically hired staff at the board. We are now dealing with the Republican board of elections, and we're dealing with Republican staff members who have been put into these positions. So we are likely going to have a very, very strict interpretation of what signs can and cannot be put up. So we want to make sure that we're not simply saying we find this sign offensive, right? Or we have problems with it. We want to try to identify signs that truly do spread misinformation of some kind. And then we can potentially have those ones removed. And so all of that really does come back around to what is the difference between campaigning, electioneering, right, that's allowed to be partisan and potentially even a little bit aggressive versus voter intimidation. So it is acceptable to engage in electioneering at a voting site, right? That means that there can be volunteers and candidates who are there advocating to voters about who they should vote for, right? So they are allowed to try to talk to voters. They are allowed to, right, potentially be louder than we would want them to be, right? Louder than might be comfortable for us. But they are allowed to be there and to advocate, right? The same way that we are. What they can't do is they cannot continue that advocacy into the buffer zone. So they have to respect, like, once the voters cross that magic line, people need to stop talking to them and the voters need to be left alone. So we want to make sure that that line is clearly marked off and that the folks who are there campaigning respect that line. Um, Also want to make sure that you don't have folks who are kind of like meeting people in the parking lot and then like following them all the way into the voting site. Again, use your context clues for this. There are definitely voters who might feel like they are intimidated by that. So we want to make sure that if we see that pattern of behavior repeated by particular volunteers, that's potentially something to flag for the election workers that are there. But really what we're paying attention to is making sure, right, that we do not have folks who are crossing into the buffer zone. Now, voter intimidation, right? That is something that goes far beyond just normal advocacy, persuasion, and trying to talk to people who don't necessarily want to be talked to. So the definition of voter intimidation in North Carolina is improper practices and attempts to obstruct, intimidate, or interfere with any person in registering or voting. So the examples that have been created by the Board of Elections in their official guidance on voter intimidation for law enforcement include, right, verbal threats of violence, disrupting or blocking the voting line, right? So again, volunteers for candidates and campaigns and all that can't stand directly in the middle of the path. You cannot make voters play that awkward dance of trying to get around you in order to get into the building. People cannot go around taking pictures or videoing voters' license plate numbers, right, or following them around the voting site, especially if they are accompanying that kind of that activity with, abrasive language, aggressive language, certainly any sorts of threats. So that's not allowed. And you're also not allowed to walk around like harassing voters by questioning their eligibility to vote or what their voting intentions are. If voters don't want to say who they're voting for, they don't need to say who they're voting for. And I can't blame them for not wanting to answer that kind of question most of the time. So those are the kinds of lines that we don't want any volunteers to be crossing. And so those are the kinds of things that we are allowed to raise. And again, these are not examples that like I made up. These are examples produced by the State Board of Elections, and the document that they come from is going to be in the folder that will be shared with y'all once we're done here. So a couple things on site safety and where some of these issues might cross into voter intimidation or just kind of voter concerns. So something that continuously surprises people and that I definitely don't love, there is no state law that prohibits people from carrying firearms at a voting site. So people are allowed to concealed carry, they are allowed to public carry when they are at a voting site. Um, the way we can get around that in some circumstances is by looking at the individual rules for a specific voting site. So for example, a lot of voting sites take place in government buildings, whether those are schools, community centers, libraries, right? It is very common, right, that we use municipal kind of city centers in order to have as a polling site. Almost all municipalities have a local ordinance saying you cannot carry a weapon into a government-owned facility. And so if that's the case, that is potentially a reason, especially if we're talking about like volunteers and campaign people on the outside, to raise with the precinct judges to say, hey, I don't think this location, like this library, doesn't allow people to have guns. Can you please go ask that person to store their firearm in the trunk of their car? So that is something just to be mindful of. There's not an absolute prohibition, but there are some local rules that you might be able to get enforced. Whether or not there's a permanent police presence, right? That is something that you should use context clues and what your knowledge of your own community to know whether or not that's a good or a bad thing for the folks that you are in community with, right? There are many places in our state where a permanent uniform police presence is not going to be seen as a sign of safety. And so it is generally discouraged to have just like a standing police presence, but it is legal. It is preferred instead that police officers who are on site be either in plain clothes, right, or they stay in the parking lot, or they just kind of drive by to make sure that everything's okay every now and then. Generally speaking, we want to not have permanent standing uniform police officers at voting sites. Um, Now, the open question that all of us have right now is, well, what about law enforcement that is not our local police or sheriff's office, but is immigration, right? Or God forbid the National Guard get deployed. And honestly, we don't have answers yet on what the rules are going to be for that or what we're going to be dealing with at the local level. Part of that is why y'all's volunteering as outdoor observers are so important. If this is going to happen, it'll probably happen in 2026. We are actively preparing for it being part of our reality in 2026, but we might get some early symptoms of it now. And so it'd be good to know that as soon as we see it. And so we will be continuously updating and creating guidance for this kind of as we go. All right. Any questions so far before we transition to talking to voters about their voting experience? So yeah, so if you do see that there are kind of a permanent uniform police officers at a location, then that is something to just let the boiler room know about. Again, it's something that we like to know. And again, in a place like, in a place like Durham, I would be surprised if the Durham Board of Elections decided that that was something that they wanted. So we would follow up with that. Law enforcement cannot ask if voters are qualified to vote. No, people are not allowed to be doing that, and that is not what law enforcement is there to do. So nobody should be asking voters that question as they go in. And thank you for that knowledge, Susan. So yeah, security of some kind, like if is generally okay. We just don't want them to be in uniform, kind of like stationed at the front door kind of thing. Again, not all voters are going to feel reassured by that. They might feel intimidated. All right. So now let's talk about talking to voters. All right, so a couple of different things about talking to a voter who is leaving the voting site. So the first thing to know if you are going to try to talk to them about what their voting experience was is, right, they might not want to talk to you, especially if they had a bad experience inside. They might be embarrassed. They might be in a bad mood. Just kind of know to expect that that is always a possibility when you talk to voters who are leaving. You do want to make sure that you station yourself outside of the buffer zone. Again, we are never talking to voters inside the buffer zone. And you also want to make sure that you clearly kind of identify yourself and offer to help, right? So it's like, hi, I'm Kat with the Democratic Party. Were you able to vote today, right? Is there anything I can do to help you figure out what to do next? The reason we want to do this is twofold. One, especially in the voter protection space, we want to honor voters' trust in talking to us about their right to vote. So we want to be candid that we are there as partisan people, even though we will help anybody who asks for our help. That being said, telling people you're a Democrat also might mean that Republicans who are voting don't ask you any follow-up questions, which I'm okay with in these times. So just tell people who you are. Don't try to hide the ball from them. And if they say, no, I don't want to talk to you, you can just say like, that's totally fine. If you want, you can offer them the voter assistance hotline number to let them know that if they have any questions, right, that they want to raise at a different time, they can call that number instead. So the top three issues we're focusing on, considering that we're not allowed to be inside the voting sites for the nonpartisan municipal elections, is photo ID, problems with registration, particularly during early voting, and then any delays or support problems. All right, so let's talk about photo ID first. So the big thing to know, right, we are now on our third election cycle of having our photo ID requirement. So voters are going to ask to be shown photo ID at the polls, but voters who do not have an ID are still allowed to vote. And that is the big thing we always want to make sure voters know. There are very many types of acceptable photo IDs. The state board has updated its list of the approved IDs, including all of the different campus and government IDs that are going to be allowed. So those resources will be shared with y'all in the folder after this as well. So the big thing we want to know about if we are talking to voters who had trouble voting is whether or not they were offered an ID exception form. So the current Board of Elections has not changed any of the existing guidance around the ID exception form. So at the moment, the rule still is boards of election and the poll workers must provide the ID exception form to voters who need it. And then the county boards of elections must count those provisional ballots that were submitted with the photo ID exception form. And so the thing we want to make sure that we ask voters is, were you offered an ID exception form by the poll worker, right? If they come out and say, I didn't have my ID, I didn't know that I needed that. Or if when going into, right, the voting site, they ask like, oh, wait, do I need my ID? I can't, like, I don't remember. I don't know what the law is, all of that. We want to make sure that we ask them, it's like, you are allowed to do it. You should be offered, or were you offered an ID exception form by the poll worker? And the reason that this matters is because if they don't have an acceptable photo ID, they are allowed to use that exception form and it will get counted by the county boards during the canvass process. And this is preferable to them leaving and going home and coming back because realistically, right, that's a big schedule commitment that not everybody can make. And if we are at election day, highly unlikely that a voter is going to leave, go home, find an ID, and come back all in the same day. So if they don't have their photo ID, it is preferable that they use the provisional ballot with the ID exception form, because their other option is submitting a provisional ballot without the exception form. The reason we really don't want people to do this is because you might remember that last year we did a massive chase and cure operation for Justice Riggs and a bunch of our House and Senate candidates. We had 2 weeks to do chase and cure. We had 2 weeks to call voters, to tell them, hey, your provisional ballot's not going to get counted yet unless you go back to your Board of Elections and show them your ID. You need to do it. You've got these 2 weeks. Can we help you do that? The law changed in December. We get 3 days now. So those voters will only have 3 days after Election Day, right? So that's not even a weekend, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, to go to their county board of elections with their ID in order to fix their provisional ballot and make sure that it gets counted. And again, realistically, that's not going to be something that's doable for most voters. Yeah, Susan, Friday at noon. Yeah, it's a crazy early deadline. All right, so separate from photo ID, the other thing we want to be asking voters about and like making sure that we are tracking is any problems that they have with registration. So some of the most common issues that voters have with registration when they show up to vote, whether that's during early voting or on election day, right, is we have an issue where a voter has not voted in the last 2 general elections, and so they've been moved to the inactive status. They are still allowed to vote. The act of voting will change their status, but a lot of voters kind of get thrown by this information, right? And they don't understand what it means and they think that it's a problem. So it can be really disorienting for them. We also have issues where a voter might have moved, right, either inside their county or to another county, and they didn't update their voter registration. We also can have a situation where a voter, right, claims that they did register, that they were registered, but their file wasn't able to be found in the system. Or you might have a situation where the poll worker, right, has a language barrier and they can't understand, right, can't understand the voter who's telling them their name and trying to have their file found. And so what we want to make sure is that the poll workers inside go through all the necessary steps to try to find that voter's file, right? Update their registration if they can, do everything possible to make sure that that voter still gets to vote. So if it's during early voting, right, that voter should be given the opportunity to update their voter registration and update any of the new information that's needed in order to complete their file. If it's on election day, right, that's trickier because we don't have same day registration on election day. So instead, that voter should still be given a provisional ballot just in case there's some sort of administrative error or something else that can be resolved during the canvass period. And then if the voter has moved, right, we need to make sure that the poll workers did their job to check that the voter is still able to vote either somewhere in that county or in that precinct. So this is something that in 2024 we realized there is a lot of variation between the counties in North Carolina on how they handle voters who have moved. So locations that still use physical poll books on election day, for example, were frequently telling people that they had to go back to their original precinct, get their voter file, their ballot authorization form, come back to their new precinct, and then vote. right? Again, that's crazy. Most voters are not doing that. And so we want to make sure that voters are being given the opportunity at the very least to cast a provisional ballot if their file was not able to be identified. So what we're always doing is we're making sure when a voter comes out and we ask them about what their voting experience was, if they identify a registration issue, we ask them, right? Were they given the option of casting a provisional ballot, or were they told to go to a different site? How was that handled? And something that we can also offer to do, the voter files are public. We can look them up. And so we can work with a voter to look to see if they, especially if they believe they were registered, see if we can find where are they registered, where is their file, and kind of help them follow up on that front. So tracking those voter registration issues is going to be important, especially because this year we are also dealing with about current list is 78,000 voters who are on the registration repair list, right? So these are voters who have been told that there is a problem with their voter registration file. And so we might have a slightly higher number of voters than we typically see experiencing problems with their registrations when they go to vote. And then the last thing that we always want to make sure that we're asking about is were there delays or support problems happening inside? And this is potentially something we really want to know about this year, because all of the folks who are in charge of monitoring the sites are for the first time going to be majority Democrat, or excuse me, majority Republicans now, again, for the first time in a long time. So normal reasons for delays, right? Printers stop working, forms can't be printed, poll workers are delayed, right? Or sometimes they get locked out of the building. You might also have a situation where ballot tabulators jam, right? Happens all the time when it's humid. It's something about the paper that ballots are on. And so we want to know, look, where are there delays that are happening inside? External delays are their own kind of thing, but we want to know about that to know that if there was a significant delay inside, that is a potential reason to keep a polling site open longer. And so we always want to know if there is a delay. During municipal elections, it can be harder to assess whether or not there's a delay, because typically we don't have lines that are super long that extend all the way outside. So normally, right, we get to just kind of notice outside that, oh, this line hasn't moved for a really long time, let's go check. It can be harder to know if there are delays when you can't see the inside of the building, because there's a shorter line and we don't have indoor observers. So it's always worth asking voters when they come out if they experience a substantial delay. And then we also want to know about, for the voters, was there a delay? Were there support issues? So voters are entitled to receive assistance when they go vote. So that can be physical assistance if they have a physical limitation but don't use curbside voting. They're entitled to have somebody help kind of move them through the voting site, move them through the process. If they have a manual dexterity issue where they can't fill in the bubbles, they're allowed to have an assistant fill in the bubbles on their ballots for them. And so all of those are forms of assistance that they are entitled to. So they are allowed to bring their own assistance if they want, right? That can be a near relative. It can be just somebody they have chosen, especially if they are disabled or if they need a translator of some kind. But they are also allowed to ask that a poll worker assist them. And so all of that is something that voters are entitled to have. And so we never want to see a voter leaving a voting site saying, well, I wasn't able to vote because I couldn't manage to fill in the bubbles. They're allowed to have somebody help them to do that. So we want to make sure that they are getting that support. And so we want to know if they are experiencing those delays or difficulties. All right. So going to the questions, so for somebody who has an ID but forgot it, so technically I forgot my ID is not on the ID exception form. If they don't know where it is, like if it is truly lost, then they're allowed to use the form. So if they say, I don't have it and I don't know where it is, they should use the ID exception form. A voter who is inactive still gets to vote a regular ballot. Simply the act of showing up should be enough to take them off. So if a voter says, I was told I was inactive and I was made to cast a provisional ballot, that's the kind of thing you would report to the boiler room. Best case scenario, there's something more happening there that wasn't explained well to the voter. Worst case scenario, there are some shenanigans, and we want to follow up with that. So poll workers who are checking voters in might tell them they're inactive. This is another thing that we see differs from county to county. Sometimes they just don't tell them because they're here. We mark them now as they've now come and voted, they're active. Sometimes you have poll workers who just tell the voters that. And I kind of wish they didn't, because again, it shouldn't actually change anything. Oh yeah, the spouses assisting voters. The voter has to tell the poll worker that they need assistance. Poll workers are not allowed to assume that a voter needs assistance, and they are not allowed to send multiple people to the same voting booth under the law. There were 3 counties in particular that were really egregious at this last year, where they just sent husbands and wives or people who like appeared to be spouses to the exact same polling booth without ever asking if that was what everybody wanted. So no, that in that situation, if the wife asks for her husband to be an assistant to help her vote, that is allowed. The poll worker should log him because they are required to keep a record of assistance, but they should not be defaulting to that. It is an archaic little loophole that exists, and I dislike it. All right. So now let's talk about, right, now you kind of know what you're looking for, you know what you're talking to voters about. What do you do, right, when there is a problem? So the thing to know about the polling site, right, is you have y'all, the observers, right, potentially like other greeters and other folks who are helping. And then you have voters, potentially their assistants. The people who are actually in charge of the voting site are the precinct judges and then the chief judge. So there is a team of 3 precinct judges at every place, 1 chief judge and 2 precinct judges. These are required by law to be multi-partisan teams. So used to be that we could kind of count on in many places where we had enough Democrats, where that 3-person team would have 2 Democrats and 1 Republican on them. That is no longer true, right? In most of the counties, these teams will be 2 Republicans and a Democrat. In some counties, it'll be 2 Republicans and an unaffiliated person. So it depends a little bit. Where we're also seeing from the kind of early reports and the list that we're collecting from all of these appointments, many of these people are doing this for the very first time. So we have extremely inexperienced poll work, precinct judges and chief judges in many places now. So something to know about who you might be dealing with. That being said, these are the ones who are in charge, and the decisions by the chief judge and those precinct judges are almost unreviewable. It is very hard to get somebody else to countermand a decision that has been made by the chief judge or the precinct judge unless they made a decision that is truly against the law. And so these are folks that we have to advocate with. So the first thing to do when you see an issue come up, ask to speak with the chief judge. So you are not talking to just poll workers in general. You are asking to speak with the chief judge in particular. And so that might mean that you have to like grab a poll worker who's doing curbside voting and ask them like, hey, I'm an observer. I need to talk to the chief judge. Can you please send them out here? If there's nobody around to ask them to bring the chief judge to you, you might need to step inside, find the first poll worker you can, or just introduce yourself at the beginning of the morning to the chief judge and say like, hi, how would you like me, right, to flag you down if I notice any issues outside? Just know that this is probably going to be Republican. So we are putting on our least controversial, friendliest faces for this because our hope is that these folks will follow the law when they are presented with it. And so we want to try to not create any barriers to them doing the right thing. The resources that you have, right, that you get to rely on to take to these chief judges is you have your quick guide that again will be emailed to y'all. That has like statutory references and like actual rules that you can use to show them, here's why I'm telling you something is a problem. And then you always have the boiler room number that you can call or text. You can have a lawyer on standby to kind of help walk you through what a particular issue is, what the basis of your complaint is, and how to approach it. So when we're approaching the chief judge, right, yes, we do it respectfully because for better or worse, they're in charge. We want to make sure then that we are being really solutions oriented with how we're approaching them, right? So for example, saying when we see a problem, there's a volunteer outside in a gray baseball hat who's following voters into the buffer zone, right? Clearly identifying the specific problem. Can you please remind him that North Carolina General Statute 163-166.4, right, specific law, forbids any person from engaging in election-relating activity in the buffer zone? A clear ask and a clear justification. You will also notice that the way this is drafted and suggestion for how I suggest you all approach this is to use nonpartisan language. If you walk in and you say, hey, those Republicans are being way too loud, right? And they're crossing into the buffer zone. If you are dealing with a hyperpartisan judge, they might just have that instinctive knee-jerk reaction of like, I think that what they're doing is probably fine. The more we can try to bypass that partisan kind of group think and get to the, hey, one of the groups of volunteers outside is playing, like, is being really loud and following people into the buffer zone. Can you please go speak to them? We slightly increase our chances, right? That the precinct judge, that the chief judge is actually going to enforce the rules, even if it might be against their own team, because they might not have recognized that when we first raised the issue with them. So this is just some of the kind of social strategy that we're trying to employ to be as savvy as possible with all of this. If the chief judge is not helpful, right? Or if you are not totally sure if you should raise something with the chief judge, that's what the boiler room is for. So if you have any questions or something that you want to report, you can call or you can text the boiler room. If you experience any particularly urgent issues, like 100% call the boiler room right away. So if you are seeing voter intimidation, if you see that there are people coming in to issue voter challenges, if you see permanent kind of law enforcement, armed presence around, or anything that stops voting in that polling site, that's a good reason to reach out to the boiler room and flag it for them. So best practices would be that you just reach out and let them know, and then we'll help, our volunteers there will help you all kind of navigate what are the next steps. And if it's something where it's like, look, we raised this with the chief judge, they're not being helpful, then we will at least know to save that report, keep it in our records, and use that to plan for next year. You'll also be sent a Google form that you can use to report kind of like at the end of the day, was there anything big that happened, right, that you saw, or like any kind of repeat issues that you noticed over time? So this information, again, will mostly help us plan for 2026. It'll also be shared with all of your county party chairs so that they can also see kind of what's getting reported out in each county. So that'll be another resource that you have. All right, and as always, you have the boiler room phone number and the voter assistance hotline. All right, and I see we have another question. So somebody who has moved and are registered at the new address but have not yet changed their license, that is not a problem. So if they've already updated their voter registration, the photo ID that they use does not have to match the address in their voter file. The photo ID is only being used to check the name and the face of the person. So if somebody says that they were turned away because their address didn't match, that's an immediate flag. All right. So what are the next steps? So oh, hold on. Let me go back. Susan, you raise your hand. Do you want to come off mute?
Thank you, Kat. Related to that, if they are coming to repair their registration,
Yeah,
and they have not changed their license, it's more complicated, right? It's like their expired or their old address driver's license is not necessarily going to help them at the moment.
So two things. So if they're on the registration repair list, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So they would still be able to use a driver's license that has an incorrect address on it, because the only thing that the driver's license is being used is the driver's license number. So that's what's being added to their voter file.
But aren't they using it for their HAVA proof too?
So updating their voter registration file is separate from a HAVA ID proof.
Okay.
The HAVA ID proof, yes, if that's what they're using it for. And that means it's the first time they're voting after they've registered. And so their address needs to be verified. In that case, their driver's license address does need to match it. Or they can bring in, right, a utility bill or, a library bill, some sort of official document. But that's for the first time that they're voting after registering, not for the registration repair list.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'm suggesting is if someone talks to you ahead of time, maybe don't try to guess whether
Correct.
their expired driver's license is going to work if they need it for anything besides their photo ID.
That's a good flag. Absolutely.
Because it's weeds.
It is weeds. There's so many nuances to all of this. So in terms of the repair, there is no live repair for the folks on the registration repair list. If they show up to vote and they haven't submitted, right, the DMV, they haven't gone through the DMV portal, they haven't submitted a form, or they did submit it and hasn't been processed yet, they will be required to cast a provisional ballot. And on the provisional ballot envelope, there is a space where they will write in their driver's license number or the last four digits of their social security number. So again, the expired license doesn't matter for registration repair. It could matter for the HAVA ID, which is a separate thing. So again, it's more of these are good things to ask the voters when they come out. If they're going in, let them know that like, hey, the poll worker should let you know that if you don't have your photo ID, like they should walk you through using the ID exception form, right? Going through the registration repair process, but talk to the poll workers inside. And then find me when you come back out, right? And let me know if you had any problems. Because yeah, guessing in advance, not going to help anyone. All right. So in terms of scheduling, outdoor poll observer scheduling is happening at the county level. So this is going to be done through your county. So go make sure to be in touch with them. Your attendance at this training, right, is being documented. So as your county folks kind of reach out to us, we'll share the list of who's gone through the trainings here so that they all know. But regardless from that, you're going to get an email probably tomorrow, and it'll have take you to a Google folder. And it's going to have a quick guide, right, with all of this kind of information in a pamphlet kind of setup. It'll have the slides from this presentation. It'll have, right, the voter kind of information survey that you can use to talk to voters. And then it'll have a whole bunch of other handouts, most of which are officially produced by the State Board of Elections. Mostly because it's like, look, as much as I would like to take credit for a lot of this stuff, the people who work at the state board on a staff level do tend to do their best. And I think it's more persuasive for you all to have official documents that are not branded by the party when you are trying to talk to these folks and advocate for voters. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. And with that, I am all done talking. So any other questions that I can answer for y'all, and I will stop sharing my screen. And if there are no questions, y'all are free to go. All right. Oh, thanks, Sharon. So I'm going to stop the recording and be all done for the night.